The cafe observation. It was a mild afternoon, the kind where the air feels neither too heavy nor too light, and the sunlight rests gently on the streets without forcing its presence. In the corner of a small cafe, a man sat alone at a wooden table, his hands wrapped loosely around a cup of tea that had been sitting long enough for the steam to fade away. The cafe itself was quiet, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that makes you notice small things, the soft clink of cups being placed on saucers, the low hum of a coffee machine in the background, the faint shuffle of newspapers being turned page by page. The man was not there to meet anyone. He was not rushing through a break between tasks, nor was he escaping from some noisy part of his day. He had simply chosen this place because it allowed him to sit, to breathe, and to watch. He was not in a hurry, and that gave him the freedom to pay attention. His eyes wandered slowly from one table to another. A young couple sat near the window, leaning in close, their voices soft and filled with the kind of excitement that new relationships carry. In another corner, an elderly man was reading a book, occasionally lifting his gaze to take slow sips of coffee, as if each sip gave him time to let the words settle in his mind. There was a rhythm to the cafe, people coming in with quick steps, others leaving in no rush at all. The man noticed how each person seemed to carry an invisible atmosphere around them, something that went beyond their clothes, beyond their expressions. Some entered the cafe and seemed to bring a lightness. With them, they greeted the staff warmly, smiled at strangers, and took their seats as if they belonged to the moment fully. Others, however, carried something different. They entered in a way that seemed to pull the room slightly inward, not loudly, not with obvious negativity, but with a certain weight that could be felt even without words. He had always been fascinated by this, the way people's presence could shift the energy of a place without them even trying. It wasn't magic or mystery. It was simply the human way of being. A person who is at peace with themselves will often give others a sense of ease. A person who is tangled in constant inner storms will often pass on that unrest without meaning to. And so he sat there, observing, letting these small truths reveal themselves in the background noise of clinking cups and quiet conversations. The man took another sip of his, now lukewarm tea, not minding the lack of heat. He liked the simplicity of the moment. No big events, no sudden changes, just the steady passing of time and the flow of people. But it was in moments like these, when nothing obvious was happening, that he noticed the most. People often thought wisdom came only from great experiences, from dramatic highs and lows, but he had found that much of what he understood about life had come from these still moments, from simply watching and listening without trying to control anything. Across the room, a woman entered, her steps calm, her gaze steady, her expression neutral. She wore plain clothes, nothing meant to stand out, and yet her presence was noticeable. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because something in the air shifted when she walked in. He didn't know her, had never seen her before, and yet there was an immediate sense that she belonged to one of those two groups he had always noticed, the ones who bring ease, or the ones who take it away. But which one she was, he could not tell yet. That was the quiet game of observation. You never rushed to decide. He thought back to how often in life people fail to notice these subtle signs. Most of the time, we meet someone and form quick judgments based on how they look, how they speak, or what they say in the first few minutes. But there is something deeper than words, something slower and quieter that reveals itself only over time. It is in the way a person treats silence. It is in how they listen when they are not the center of attention. It is in the way they speak about others when those others are not around. The man had learned, not from books or lectures, but from years of paying attention, that much of a person's truth is shown when they think no one is studying them. And in a place like this cafe, where people let their guard down just enough to show small glimpses of who they really are, he could see patterns repeating over and over. He didn't want to turn life into a game of constant suspicion, nor did he want to carry a cynical view that everyone was hiding something harmful. Instead, he believed in the quiet balance of awareness, of noticing the details without obsessing over them. This balance was what kept him from falling into relationships friendships, or connections that would slowly erode his peace. He knew that not every harm comes in a loud, obvious form. Sometimes harm arrives with a smile, with a kind voice, with friendly words, but carries a shadow that only appears after time has passed. The tea was nearly gone now, and the light outside had shifted just slightly, the afternoon beginning to lean into evening. The man remained seated, his gaze still soft, his mind still clear. He had no desire to move yet. Observing life was not a waste of time for him. It was a way of learning without having to make every mistake firsthand. He had made enough mistakes before rushing into connections simply because they felt warm at the start, only to realize later that warmth can sometimes be a mask for something colder. And so, scene one closed not with a big event, not with a sudden twist, but with a man sitting quietly, letting the world pass in front of him, collecting small pieces of human truth that would later help him make choices that protected his peace. The woman who had entered moments ago was now sitting at a table across from him. He didn't stare, didn't try to guess too much yet, but deep down, he knew, if you watch closely, the truth about people always arrives, even if it comes slowly. The first meeting, it was a week later when the man saw her again. This time, not in the small cafe where he often went to read and think, but in a quiet bookstore just a short walk from there. The bookstore was one of those places that never felt crowded, not because it was unpopular, but because the people who came here valued silence. The scent of paper and ink filled the air. Mixed with the faint trace of coffee from a small machine in the corner, the man had been in the philosophy section, running his fingers along the spines of books without much urgency. He wasn't there to buy anything specific. Sometimes he came just to be around books, as if their stillness carried a kind of wisdom of its own. And then, while turning into the next aisle, he saw her. She was standing with her back to him, flipping through the pages of a hardbound novel. Her posture was relaxed, yet her movements were deliberate, as though she was actually reading instead of just skimming. He recognized her from the cafe instantly, the calm walk, the steady gaze. There was no mistaking it. She wore the same kind of simple clothing, not flashy, not designed to catch attention. But it was exactly that simplicity that made her noticeable in a different way. He didn't approach her at once. Instead, he took a book from the shelf and began to read its back cover while keeping her in the corner of his vision. He wasn't spying, rather he was giving himself time. He had learned over the years that rushing to connect with someone often meant skipping the most important part of knowing them, observing, eventually. They found themselves standing near the same shelf, looking at books just a few steps apart. She noticed him and offered a polite nod. The kind strangers give when they've crossed paths more than once. "You were at the cafe last week," she said softly, her voice even and measured. He smiled slightly. "Yes, I go there often. It's a good place to think." She agreed with a small tilt of her head. "I like quiet places too." The exchange was brief, just a few words, but her tone carried a certain steadiness, not too warm, not the subtle drain. Over the next few weeks, their paths began to cross more often. Sometimes it was by chance, passing each other on the street, finding themselves in the same cafe or browsing in the same bookstore aisle. Other times it was by quiet arrangement. A suggestion would be made almost casually, "I'll be at the cafe tomorrow afternoon," or "There's a small park near here. Maybe we could walk there sometime." The man did not see any harm in it. She seemed easy to talk to, polite, and she had a certain way of speaking that made conversations flow without awkward pauses. In the beginning, there was a lightness to their interactions. They would sit with cups of tea or coffee and talk about ordinary things, books they had read, places they liked in the city, memories from their younger years. Nothing too deep, nothing too personal, just small exchanges that seemed harmless. But slowly, almost without him noticing, the tone of their conversations began to change. It started with little remarks about other people. At first they seemed harmless, casual comments about a mutual acquaintance or a stranger in the cafe. But the man began to notice that these remarks were rarely kind. Even when she spoke with a soft voice and a calm expression, her words often carried a weight that made them linger uncomfortably in the mind. A simple observation about someone's clothing would turn into a quiet critique of their taste. A story about a friend's decision would drift toward pointing out their flaws. The man didn't confront it at first. He told himself it was just her way of talking, perhaps a habit she didn't even realize she had. And yet, he began to notice something new, a feeling that followed him after their meetings. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't sadness exactly, but a kind of heaviness. He would leave the cafe or the park feeling more tired than when he had arrived, as if the air had been slowly pulled out of the conversation without either of them acknowledging it. He tried to understand it, without rushing to judgment, he thought, about the way certain people, without shouting or obvious negativity, could still take away your sense of calm. It was never dramatic. There was no argument, no outright insult, no clear moment where you could say, "Here is where the harm began." Instead, it was something that built quietly over time, a drip, drip, drip of small comments that seemed harmless in isolation but added up to something heavier one afternoon. As they sat in their usual corner of the cafe, she began telling a story about a mutual acquaintance, someone the man respected. She didn't raise her voice or speak with malice, but her words carried an undertone of dismissal, as if she were slowly reducing that person to their weakest moments. The man nodded politely, but inside he felt uneasy. He noticed how the conversation had shifted without him realizing it, from sharing stories to quietly tearing others down. As the weeks passed, these patterns became clearer. She often directed the flow of conversation toward other people's mistakes, shortcomings, or failures. Even when they spoke about broader topics, books, films, news, she had a way of framing them so that someone somewhere was at fault. And though she never criticized the man directly, he began to realize that the energy she carried was not one of building, but of taking apart. He began to pay more attention to how he felt in her presence. The body, he had learned, often knows before the mind does. When he was around people who lifted him up, he would feel lighter, more awake, even if they spoke for hours. But after spending time with her, he noticed the opposite, a slight tension in his shoulders, a quiet fatigue in his thoughts, a reluctance to start the rest of his day. It wasn't that she was a bad person in some obvious way. She was polite to waiters, respectful in public, and spoke with a tone that never seemed aggressive. But the man had learned that not all harm comes in loud forms. Sometimes the most damaging presence is the one that feels calm on the surface, but carries a slow erosion beneath it. And this erosion was what he was beginning to notice. One evening, after parting ways with her, the man walked home through the quiet streets of the city. The air was cool, and the sound of his footsteps echoed lightly against the pavement. He thought about the conversations they had shared, trying to recall moments that had truly inspired him or made him feel stronger. He couldn't think of many. What came to mind instead were the subtle criticisms, the small but constant focus on what was wrong with people rather than what was right. By the time he reached his door, he understood something he had ignored for weeks. Peace is not always taken from you by loud conflict. More often, it is taken quietly, in small moments, by people who do not seem dangerous at all. And once you begin to notice it, you cannot unsee it. The man didn't decide anything that night. He was not impulsive by nature, but he knew he would need to watch more closely. The truth about people, he reminded himself, is rarely revealed all at once. It shows itself slowly, like a shadow moving with the sun, easy to miss if you don't take the time to notice where it falls. The quiet walk. It was a late afternoon when the man and the woman decided to take a walk in a park near the cafe. The air carried a faint chill, but it was the kind that felt refreshing rather than cold. The sky was pale, holding a thin layer of clouds that softened the sunlight into a gentle glow. The park itself was calm, not empty, but far from crowded. Here and there, a few people sat on benches, reading newspapers or talking softly. Children played at a distance, their laughter light and harmless, blending into the background without breaking the stillness of the place. They walked side by side on a narrow path lined with tall trees. The leaves above rustled lightly whenever the wind passed through, creating a sound almost like quiet conversation between the branches. Every so often, they passed other walkers, exchanging the polite nods that strangers share in peaceful places. At first, their conversation matched the calm of the park. They spoke about the weather, about a book she had been reading, about the way the city felt different in certain seasons. The man found himself enjoying the rhythm of the walk, the steady pace, the fresh air, the lack of rush. He had always believed that walking with someone revealed more about them than sitting across a table could. In a walk, the conversation had room to breathe. Silences didn't feel heavy, and the world around you offered small breaks that kept the moment natural. But as they walked further, the tone began to shift again, not suddenly, not in an obvious way, but in the slow, familiar pattern he had begun to recognize. She brought up a mutual acquaintance once more, someone they both knew from the cafe. She spoke of this person's habits, their choices, their mistakes. The words were not sharp or openly cruel, but they carried a quiet certainty that the person being discussed was somehow lesser, somehow failing in ways that only she seemed to notice. The man listened without interrupting, but inside he felt the same quiet heaviness that had followed him in their earlier meetings. It was not what she was saying about that particular person. He did not know them well enough to defend or agree, but rather the pattern itself. The steady turning of conversation toward the flaws of others, the way she seemed more comfortable, pointing out what was wrong than appreciating what was right. They reached a small pond in the center of the park, where ducks moved slowly across the water. The surface reflected the soft gray of the sky, broken here and there by the gentle ripples made by the birds. They stood there for a while, watching in silence. For the man, it was a relief, a pause in the flow of words that had begun to feel heavier than the walk itself. In that stillness, he found space to think. He thought about how different people respond to quiet moments. Some see them as awkward and rush to fill them with words. Others let them be, understanding that silence is not empty but full of its own meaning. The woman beside him seemed comfortable in silence, but when she did speak again, the words returned to their familiar direction, toward someone else's faults. It was then, in the middle of the park with the ducks drifting across the water, that the man felt a quiet clarity settle in. The most dangerous presence in your life is not always the one that argues with you, shouts at you, or openly disrespects you. Sometimes it is the presence that gently, consistently shifts your focus toward the negative until you begin to see the world through a darker lens without even realizing it. As they continued walking, he tested this thought in his mind. He imagined for a moment how he might feel if every walk, every conversation, every meeting slowly left him more tired than before. He imagined months of this, maybe years, what it would do to his view of people, of relationships, of life itself. He knew that no matter how polite or pleasant someone seemed on the surface, if their presence slowly replaced his peace with restlessness, it was a cost he could not afford to keep paying. They passed under a row of trees where the light filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns. The man noticed how the ground beneath them was uneven, and how, without thinking, he adjusted his steps to stay balanced. It occurred to him that relationships worked in much the same way. Sometimes you found yourself constantly adjusting, making small compromises just to stay steady. But if those adjustments became too frequent, too automatic, you risked forgetting what it felt like to walk on level ground. Near the end of their walk, they came across a small wooden bench facing the pond. They sat down for a few minutes, and the conversation drifted to lighter topics again, a recipe she wanted to try, a street she had recently discovered with interesting shops. The man responded politely, but his mind was no longer fully in the exchange. He had begun to understand something that had been forming quietly in the background for weeks. It was not about whether she was a good person or a bad person. Life was rarely so simple. It was about the effect she had on him, the subtle way her presence left him feeling smaller rather than larger, heavier rather than lighter. And it was about the choice he had to make, not out of anger, not out of judgment, but out of respect for his own peace. When they finally left the park, parting ways at the street corner, the man walked home alone. The air felt lighter somehow. though nothing dramatic had happened. The walk had not ended in an argument or a revelation spoken aloud. But in his mind, the quiet decision had begun to form. Some people lift you without trying. Others drain you without meaning to. The wisdom lies in knowing the difference before too much of your own light has been dimmed. Choosing peace over change. A few days passed before the man saw her again. In that time, he carried the quiet thoughts from their walk in the park with him, letting them settle in his mind like leaves floating down to still water. He didn't rush to any conclusion, because he knew that quick decisions, especially about people, could sometimes be clouded by mood or temporary emotion. Instead, he gave himself space. In those days, his routine went on as usual. He visited the same cafe. In the afternoons, read his books in the same quiet corner, and took his evening walks along familiar streets. But even in the middle of these everyday habits, he found himself thinking more carefully about the effect people had on him. He replayed their conversations in his mind, not to find fault, but to understand the pattern. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that every time he left her company, his thoughts felt heavier than when he had arrived. It wasn't something obvious. If anyone else had been watching, they might have said they seemed like two people enjoying normal, calm interactions. There was no shouting, no visible tension. But the man had learned long ago that not all harm is visible. Some of it lives quietly in the mind, changing the way you see the world without making any loud announcements. One afternoon, they met again at the cafe, sitting at their usual table near the window. The sunlight streamed in through the glass, touching the wooden surface between them. She began speaking about a recent situation involving a friend of hers, and once again the tone leaned toward criticism. It wasn't angry, but it was steady, pointing out what had gone wrong, what the friend had done poorly, how she could have done better in their place. The man listened, nodding occasionally, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the way certain people can shift the weather inside you. With some, your inner sky feels clear and open. With others, small clouds begin to gather until you realize you are standing under a shade you never noticed forming. He thought about how he had begun to feel after each meeting with her, and how that feeling was not something he wanted to carry into the rest of his life. He remembered a lesson he had learned years ago. You cannot always change the nature of another person. Sometimes they are not even aware of what they carry. And even if they are, it is not your role to reshape them into someone else. People grow and change on their own timelines, not according to your wishes. This was not about fixing her. It was about choosing whether or not to keep walking alongside her. As she spoke, he felt a kind of quiet acceptance rise within him. He did not need to explain anything to her, did not need to make a grand announcement or deliver a lecture about negativity. In fact, he knew that doing so might only lead to defensiveness or misunderstanding. Some decisions are better made silently, carried out through simple changes in your own steps rather than dramatic exits after they finish their tea. They walked together toward the street where their paths usually divided. At the corner, she smiled and said, "See you soon?" Her tone was casual, expecting the usual agreement. The man returned the smile, but his answer was softer than usual. "We'll see." It wasn't a promise, and it wasn't a refusal. It was simply a door left slightly open, but one he already knew he would not walk through often, if at all. In the days that followed, he allowed the distance to grow naturally. He didn't arrange new meetings. When their paths crossed by chance, he was polite and warm, but he didn't linger. He kept his focus on the people and places that left him feeling lighter, more present, more at ease. And slowly the heaviness he had been carrying began to fade. He realized something important during this time, something he wished he had understood earlier in life. Protecting your peace is not about building walls so high that no one can reach you. It is about knowing which doors to close gently, which paths to step away from, and which company leaves you better than they found you. There will always be people who drain more than they give, not out of cruelty, but simply because of the way they live, speak, or see the world. And it is not your duty to stay close to them in the hope that your presence will somehow shift their nature. The truth is, the most respectful thing you can do, both for them and for yourself, is to quietly choose a little more distance one evening. As the sun was setting and the streets were painted in warm orange light, the man sat alone on a park bench. The air was calm, the kind that makes you breathe more slowly without realizing it. He watched people pass by, some in groups, some alone, each carrying their own invisible weather. And in that moment, he felt no bitterness, no regret, just gratitude for the lesson. He understood now that wisdom is not only in knowing who to let into your life, but also in recognizing without drama who to step away from. It is not a sign of weakness or coldness. It is simply the quiet strength of someone who values peace more than the comfort of familiar patterns. The woman would remain, somewhere in the city, living her life as she always had, and he would remain here, walking his own path, free to keep his inner sky clear, because if you are a man, or anyone at all, there is always one kind of person you must learn to avoid. The one who, slowly and without meaning to, takes away more of your light than they ever give back.